Well, Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and author of The Palestine Laboratory, a book on Israel's arms and surveillance industry. He joins us from Sydney. Welcome to the programme. What did you make of the narrative that seemed to take hold soon after the football disturbances occurred?
This is a classic case, and sadly I've seen these kinds of things many times before in other countries, of European officials being paralysed by the inability or unwillingness to actually criticise Israel and Israeli actions. Now, any anti-Semitic attacks against Jews or Israelis in Amsterdam should be condemned. There's no question about that, and I say that as someone Jewish and just as a human being. But the context for this is vital. The context is that for the day and a half before these scuffles, there were genocidal comments made by these Maccabi Israeli team against Arabs, pulling down Palestinian flags, basically essentially calling for death to Arabs, which I might add, in Israel itself, these Israeli football teams are notorious for being deeply racist and deeply genocidal. And it's pretty likely, frankly, that some of the soldiers who had fought in Gaza are probably part of these so-called Israeli football teams in Amsterdam. So the idea somehow that an Israeli football team can go around Amsterdam spewing hate and somehow the problem begins with any counter-protest, it's not just ahistorical, it also demeans what real anti-Semitism and the fight against it needs to be. And as I said, as someone Jewish who sees Israeli football fans calling for the mass death of Palestinians in Palestine, I'm so ashamed and outraged that a lot of European officials have not been talking about that, to the point where, just to finish, that Dutch officials are asking for those Israeli fans to come back to the Netherlands. That's the kind of skewed moral compass these people have.
And how dangerous, then, do you think, is this kind of narrative going forward?
Look, the weaponisation of anti-Semitism is something that I and many others have written about before. Real anti-Semitism, attacks against Jews because they're Jews, attacking synagogues, is a problem. And in some parts of the world, it is a real issue that needs to be tackled and addressed. And I've said that, as many people have for a long time, long before October 7. But the idea somehow, as the Israeli government and some other people have suggested, that what's happened in Amsterdam is akin to Nazi Germany, pogroms, is insane. And it really cheapens the real necessary battle against anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism, not faux anti-Semitism. And weaponisation of this, actually, the implication of all this really, in my view, is that it says that because Jews are so unsafe, so the argument goes, they need a secure homeland, Israel. And the problem with that is two things briefly. One, Israeli actions in Gaza, Lebanon, mass slaughter of Palestinians make all of us, including Jews, far less safe. And somehow it really begs this disbelief that we're not supposed to talk about what Israel has been doing in Gaza and Lebanon for the last 12 plus months, genocide and mass slaughter. It's absurd. And I think a lot of people do not want to recognise that fact and rather indulge Israeli eternal victimhood rather than addressing the problem at hand. A lot of us don't accept it.
And what we saw in Amsterdam then, why is this so easily coalesced around football, do you think?
Look, in Israel, I mean, obviously there's a long history of soccer hooliganism in the UK, in other countries. So hooliganism sadly does not begin and end in Israel. But there's a long history of Israeli football teams that are deeply racist. And one can Google this and find this out in 2 seconds. There's been films made about it. Teams that openly talk about genocide at football games in Israel. A targeting of any black players, Palestinian players, Arab players, either coming from Israel or those who are brought in from outside. There's a long history of this. And there is this kind of arrogance and delusion that somehow Israeli fans can take that to Holland, spew their hate, and expect no pushback. Now, again, to be clear, anyone that's attacking Jews violently needs to be arrested and dealt with. There's no question about that. But I don't hear about anyone being arrested on the Israeli side who are pulling down flags, disorder, spewing hate. No one's talking about that. Why is that? Because, again, European officials are paralysed by the fear of being accused of anti-Semitism because of the history of European officials towards Jews historically. and they are paralyzed, being unable to talk about this in an honest and frank way, even despite the last 12 months. What they don't realize, frankly, is that what their actions are doing is not just indulging Israeli actions, but means somehow that we aren't allowed to openly talk about what Israel has been doing in the Middle East for the last, frankly, 80 years, but especially in the last year. And that's just not dishonest, but also dangerous.
OK, we'll leave it there. Antony Loewenstein, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much.